The cave was not supposed to be the answer. It was just a hole in a limestone ridge 3 miles west of a Montana settlement that had no name worth remembering, a dark mouth in the hillside that trappers passed without slowing and hunters used only when rain came sideways and there was nowhere else to go. From the outside, it looked like nothing. Cold, stone, shadow, silence. But on a morning in January 1891, when the temperature outside had not risen above -20, for 11 days straight, Reverend Samuel Fitch walked toward that cave with the careful steps of a man who expected to find suffering. He had been making his rounds. That was what he called it, making his rounds, though everyone in the settlement understood what it really meant. Checking on the ones who might not make it. The old, the sick, the alone. He carried a satchel with dried meat and 2 tins of condensed milk, the kind of supplies a man brings when he believes the person he is visiting has already run out of choices. Clara Marsh was on his list. A widow, 2 young children, living in a cave since November, which most people in town considered proof enough that she had lost her footing in the world. Fitch climbed the slope, his boots breaking through the frozen crust of snow with each step. The wind was working hard that morning, driving out of the north with the kind of patience that does not tire, and he pulled his collar up and kept his eyes down. When he reached the cave entrance, he stopped. He noticed the smoke first, or rather the absence of it. Every chimney in the settlement had been pushing thick columns of white smoke into the sky for 11 days. Men were burning through their wood supplies at a rate that frightened even the ones who had planned carefully. But above this limestone ridge rising from a narrow fissure in the rock, there was only a thin thread of gray, barely visible, intermittent, like something almost finished rather than something working hard. Fitch stepped closer to the cave entrance and waited for the cold to deepen the way it always did near stone in winter. It did not. The air near the opening felt different, calmer. The wind that had been cutting through his coat on the hillside seemed to slide past this particular place without finding purchase. He called out. A moment passed. Then Clara Marsh appeared from a low wooden door set back inside the cave entrance, and Fitch stopped breathing for just a second because she was wearing a wool dress and nothing else. No coat, no shawl around her shoulders. Her hands were bare. Behind her in the dim light, he could see her 2 children, Anna, who was 9, and Daniel, who had just turned 6. They were sitting on the floor playing with small carved wooden animals, and neither of them was bundled in layers. Reverend, she said. Her voice was quiet and even, the voice of a woman who had not been startled by anything in a long time. Come in if you would like. Close the outer door behind you. He stepped through into a short passage, and the change in the air was immediate. Not just warmer, stable, no draft, no cold spots pressing in from the walls. He moved through the inner door into the main shelter, and his eyes went directly to the small mercury thermometer mounted on the wall beside the entrance. 82 degrees Fahrenheit. He stared at it. That cannot be right, he said. It has been between 78 and 84 for the past week, Clara said. She moved to the small masonry stove against the back wall and gestured toward it. I burned 3 logs this morning. That will hold until tonight. Fitch walked to the stove and held his hand near the surface. Warm, solid, nothing like the iron stoves in town that glowed red hot and still left corners of rooms at 40 degrees. He looked at the walls, thick and doubled the stone floor beneath his feet, radiating a gentle and constant heat. He looked at the children, who had glanced up at him briefly and then returned to their game with the indifference of children who had not been cold in a very long time. How much wood are you using? He asked. 2 logs a day, Clara said. Sometimes 3 if I am cooking something that needs sustained heat. Fitch did the math without meaning to. 2 logs a day across a full winter meant roughly a cord every 2 months. 6 cords for the season, perhaps less. Most families in the settlement were burning through a cord every 4 days during this cold snap. Some faster. He asked the question that had been forming since he walked through the door. How long does the heat last after the fire dies? Clara walked to the stove and opened the firebox. The coals inside glowed faintly, almost no visible flame. This fire has been going for 6 hours, she said. I will add 1 log before the children go to sleep, and the stone will keep the room above 70 until morning. If I let it go out completely, the temperature drops to 65 over about 8 hours and then holds there. 65 degrees with no fire. in a winter that had already killed livestock across 3 counties. Fitch turned slowly and looked at everything again, the way a man does when he realizes he has been thinking about something wrong for a long time. "How did you know to build it this way?" he said. Clara looked at him steadily. "I didn't invent any of it," she said. "Masonry stoves are German. Double walls are standard in root cellars. Stone floors hold heat in every old barn I have ever been in. I put the pieces together and let the cave do the rest." He left 20 minutes later, the satchel with the dried meat and condensed milk still in his hand unused. He stood outside in the wind for a moment before starting back down the slope, looking up at that thin thread of smoke rising from the fissure in the limestone. Then he turned and walked directly toward Roy Dunbar's house. But that is where we are going, and we are not there yet. Because to understand what Clara Marsh built inside that cave and why it mattered, you have to understand what she was facing before she built it. You have to start in March. Thomas Marsh drowned crossing the Milk River on a Thursday afternoon in March of 1890, when the spring melt had turned the water fast and cold and deceptively deep. In places it had been shallow the week before. He had crossed that river dozens of times. He knew it. He was 41 years old, physically capable, not careless. But rivers and snowmelt do not care about experience or caution, or the fact that a man has a wife and 2 young children waiting for him on the other side of the season. The body was recovered 2 days later, 3 miles downstream. Clara was 32 years old when they buried him. Anna was 8. Daniel was 5. She had been a seamstress before the marriage, and she was a seamstress after it, which meant she had work, but not enough of it income, but not enough of it a roof over her head, but not enough warmth beneath it. The cabin she and Thomas had built together 3 years earlier was serviceable. Square corners, plank floors, a stone chimney that drew well enough when the wind came from the south. When it came from the north, which was most of the time between November and March, the chimney smoked. Not enough to be dangerous, just enough to be a constant reminder that the structure was imperfect, that Cole was looking for every crack and finding most of them. The previous winter, before Thomas died, they had burned through 9 cords of wood. 9 cords between the 2 of them with 2 children to keep warm, and by February the inside of the windows still had frost on them in the mornings, and the children slept in so many wool layers they could barely turn over in bed. 9 cords at the price of wood in northern Montana was not a comfortable number for a seamstress raising 2 children alone. Clara did the calculation in August when she was still in the numb practical phase of grief that comes before the larger weight settles in. She made shirts for loggers. She took in mending from 3 families in town. She altered dresses for women who had put on weight or lost it. She was good at her work and reliable, and the people who hired her knew it, which meant she had a steadier supply of work than most women in her position. But 9 cords was still 9 cords, and that was a normal winter. She had read enough from her father's books mostly to know that the coming winter might not be a normal one. The old-timers had been talking all summer about the signs. The thickness of the caterpillar wool, the early departure of the geese, the way the elk had been moving down from the high country 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Clara was not superstitious, but she was observant, and she trusted the men who had watched this country through 30 or 40 winters more than she trusted her own optimism. She sat at her sewing table in the August heat and worked through the numbers carefully. If the winter ran hard and long, she might need 12 cords. 12 cords at current prices was a sum that would strip her reserves down to almost nothing, and if the spring was late or work was slow, she would begin the following summer already behind. She needed a different answer. Not a perfect one, just one that worked. The cave had been in her mind since late May, which was when she first let herself think about Thomas's words without falling apart. He had shown it to her 2 years before he died on a Sunday afternoon in October, when they had taken the children walking along the limestone ridge west of town, looking for late chokecherries. The cave entrance was partially hidden by a stand of Douglas fir, the opening narrow no more than 8 feet across. Thomas had ducked inside and called back to her, his voice bouncing off the stone walls with a strange hollow warmth. "Come in here," he said. "Feel this?" She had stepped inside and one hand on Daniel's shoulder to keep him from running ahead in the dark. The air was different inside, not just sheltered, genuinely warming even on that cool October afternoon. The stone held something, a memory of summer maybe, a kind of patience. Thomas had pressed his palm flat against the back wall of the cave, where the ceiling rose to nearly 12 feet, and the chamber widened to almost 20. If we were poorer than we are, he said, this is where we would live. This stone has been warm longer than any house I have ever been in. He was joking or half joking, the way he often was when he was also being serious about something. Clara had laughed, and they had found a good handful of choke cherries before heading home, and she had not thought about the cave again until after the funeral, after the numbers, after August had made the question impossible to avoid. She went back to it alone on a Wednesday in early September when the children were in school, and she had 2 hours between finishing one mending job and starting the next. The cave was exactly as she remembered. The entrance faced southeast, sheltered from the prevailing north and west winds by the fir trees. The opening was narrow, but the chamber inside widened quickly. The ceiling at the center rose to 12 feet. The floor sloped gently downward toward the back, where the depth reached 40 feet, and the stone was densely compacted limestone, dry and cold to the touch, even in the last warmth of September. Cold to the touch, she noted. That was important. Not damp, not weeping moisture. Cold the way stone holds cold, which is the same way it holds heat. Slowly, thoroughly, for a long time. She had read about thermal mass in one of her father's surveying manuals, a dry technical description of why stone buildings stayed cooler in summer and warmer in winter than wood frame structures of the same size. She had read about masonry stoves in a pamphlet she had found tucked inside a German almanac someone had left at the general store, a description of how the settlers in the upper Midwest had adapted European heating methods to the American climate, building fireboxes out of brick and clay that burned small amounts of wood and radiated heat for hours through the dense stone mass surrounding the fire chamber. She had read these things the way she read most things, carefully and practically, without deciding in advance whether they were useful. Now, standing in the back of this cave with her hand against the limestone wall, she decided they were useful. She stood in the cave for 30 minutes, measuring distances with her stride, estimating ceiling heights, marking in her mind where the cold air would settle and where the heat would rise. The stone around her had been insulated by 60 feet of rock on every side. It would never be warm on its own, but it would hold warmth if she could get warmth into it. She walked home and started sketching on the back of a piece of brown wrapping paper. The community's opinion of Clara's plan formed quickly and without much variation. Roy Dunbar stated it most directly. He was 48 years old, the most skilled carpenter in the settlement, a man who had built or helped build more than half the structures in the county. He had opinions about construction, the way some men have opinions about scripture, with the absolute certainty of someone who has never been seriously wrong and does not expect to start. He was at the general store on a Saturday morning in late September when word had got in around that the Marsh widow was hauling lumber up to the cave west of town. He said what he thought without being asked, which was characteristic. I have been framing houses for 20 years, he said, to no one in particular and everyone present. You do not put people in the ground. Air does not circulate. Mold sets in. When the spring melt comes, that whole ridge will seep. She is going to flood out or run out of wood before February, and those children are going to pay for her stubbornness. The other men in the store said nothing in response, which Dunbar took for agreement. Some of them agreed. Some of them simply did not want to be on the wrong side of a statement about a widow's choices. Winifred Crail heard about the plan differently from a student whose older sister had seen Clara making multiple trips up the ridge with a handcart. Winifred was the settlement's school teacher, 40 years old, a woman who had come west from Ohio 12 years earlier and stayed because the West had needed her skills more obviously than Ohio had. She was practical in the way that educators in small remote communities have to be practical, comfortable with unconventional solutions to genuine problems, but also aware of how quickly unconventional solutions became reasons for communities to withdraw their support from the people attempting them. She visited Clara on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, approaching the cave entrance with the particular carefulness of a woman who has learned to assess situations before committing to a position. Clara was working inside the cave when Winifred arrived, fitting planks for the second layer of the interior wall. She came out when she heard footsteps on the slope, her hands gray with clay dust, her hair loose from whatever she had tied it back with that morning. Winifred looked at the lumber framing visible through the cave entrance, at the lines Clara had scratched into the cave floor with a piece of flint to mark her construction boundaries. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question that Clara had not yet been asked by anyone. "Where did you learn to think about it this way?" she said. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. She paused the way she always paused before answering questions that deserved real answers rather than quick ones. "My father was a surveyor," she said. "He had books. One of them explained why stone buildings stay warmer in winter than wood ones. Another, a German pamphlet, described a type of stove that burned small fires but held the heat for hours through the stone mass around the firebox. I read them when I was young, and I remembered them." She looked at the cave entrance, then back at Winifred. "I did not invent any of this. I only read it and believed it enough to try it." Winifred was quiet for a moment. She looked at the construction framing inside the cave entrance, at the doubled wall taking shape in the dim light. "It is already warmer in there than I expected," she said. "The stone holds what warmth there is," Clara said. "That is the whole idea." Winifred chose her next words with the careful deliberateness of a woman who had navigated small community politics for 12 years. "People are going to watch this closely," she said. "You understand that. If something goes wrong, the town will remember that you chose this." Clara met her eyes without flinching. "I know how judgment works," she said. "People need to see failure before they can accept an unconventional success. I am not trying to prove anything to anyone. I am trying to keep my children warm." Winifred nodded slowly. She accepted that in the way that practical people accept statements that are both true and complete. She stayed another 20 minutes asking questions about the stove design and the wall spacing, her questions precise and genuinely curious rather than skeptical. Before she left, she said she would come back when the structure was more complete. She did come back 3 weeks later. By then, the inner room was framed, the double walls were up, and the floor stones were in place beneath the elevated plank flooring. She walked through the vestibule and into the main shelter and stood in the center of the space for a long time without saying anything. "It is smaller than I imagined," she finally said. 14 feet by 10, Clara said. 8 feet of ceiling height, enough for 3 people and everything we need." Winifred ran her hand along the inner wall, feeling the clay and moss chinking between the planks. She looked up at the doubled ceiling canvas, and board again, the dead air trapped between each layer. "The principle is sound," she said quietly, more to herself than to Clara. "Physics does not care about appearances," Clara said. Construction took 6 weeks, all of it in the hours Clara could spare from her sewing work and from the daily management of 2 children whose lives had been upended by their father's death 8 months earlier, and who needed above everything else a mother who was present and steady. She woke before dawn each weekday. She would start a fire in the cabin stove, make the children's breakfast, get them dressed and pointed towards school, and then spend 2 hours at the cave before her first sewing customer arrived. On Sunday afternoons after church, when Anna and Daniel could play on the hillside within earshot, she worked longer stretches. She was not building quickly. She was building correctly. The interior room went up first 15 feet back from the cave entrance, where the ceiling height was still generous and the cave floor was level. She built the outer wall of vertical planks, standing them close together and chinking every gap with clay, mixed with dried moss, pressing the mixture in with her fingers until it was dense and consistent. Then she built the second wall 12 inches outside the first, creating a dead air chamber between them. She filled the gap partially with dried grass and pine needles gathered from the hillside, loose enough to trap air pockets, dense enough to slow heat transfer significantly. The floor required this most physical effort. She carried flat stones up the ridge in her handcart trip after trip, choosing stones that were dense and roughly even in thickness. She laid them directly on the cave floor in an overlapping pattern, mortaring the joints with clay. Above the stone layer, she built a raised plank floor on low wooden sleepers, leaving a 4-inch gap between the cold stone below and the living surface above. Cold air from the cave floor would settle in that gap and stay there. The living space would remain separated from the ground chill. The ceiling was doubled the same way as the walls. Boards first, then a layer of old canvas she had traded 2 weeks of mending work to acquire from a freighter whose wagon cover had cracked along the seams and was being replaced. Above the canvas, more boards. Heat rising from the living space would warm the air trapped between the layers, and that trapped air would slow the heat's escape into the cold upper reaches of the cave. The masonry stove she built last, and it was the most demanding part of the work. She had seen exactly one masonry stove in her life 2 years before Thomas died, in the home of a German family named Hofer, who had settled 12 miles north of town. She had been there to deliver a repaired coat, and Herman Hofer had shown her the stove with the particular pride of a man demonstrating something he knew most people in the area had never encountered. It was built from fire brick and dense clay mortar, with a small firebox at the base and a series of internal channels. She remembered him calling them flues that wound through the stone mass in a serpentine path before the smoke reached the chimney. The heat from the fire did not go straight up and out. It traveled sideways and sideways again, giving up its energy to the surrounding stone mass at every turn. The stone absorbed that heat and held it. Long after the fire burned down to coals, the stone was still radiating warmth into the room. The fire brick she needed had come at cost. She had spent 2 months of mending work trading with a man who was demolishing an old kiln 20 miles east, and she had transported the bricks herself in 3 separate handcart loads, each trip taking a full day. By the time she had enough brick, she understood the weight and density of the material in a way that made the theory in the German pamphlet feel completely concrete. She built the firebox small 18 inches wide and 14 inches deep because a small, dense fire in a masonry stove, it is more efficient than a large fire in an open fireplace. The channels wound upward through the stone mass in 3 passes before reaching the chimney, which she vented through a natural fissure in the cave ceiling that she had widened carefully with a hand chisel over 3 long Sundays. The draft, when she tested it with a piece of smoldering pine, drew cleanly upward. The smoke had a path. The heat did not. Against the back wall of the cave, the natural limestone itself, she laid an additional layer of flat river stones mortared with clay. This became a radiant wall positioned directly opposite the stove, designed to absorb heat from the fire and release it slowly back into the room long after the fire itself had faded. Stone receiving heat from one side and giving it back to the other, patient and reliable, indifferent to the cold pressing in from outside. The entrance to the inner shelter she oriented deliberately facing away from the cave mouth and toward the back wall. This meant that anyone entering had to turn, had to travel through the 5-foot vestibule passage, had to change direction before reaching the main door. Cold air entering from outside would lose its momentum in that passage, dropping its energy in the airlock space between the outer and inner doors before it could reach the living area. She finished on a Thursday in early November. She stood in the completed inner shelter and looked at what she had built. It was not beautiful. The walls were rough lumber, darkened with clay. The floor planks were uneven. The masonry stove was functional but graceless, built by hands that were skilled at fine needlework and not at masonry, and it showed. The ceiling was low enough that she had to think about her posture near the stove. But it was tight, every gap sealed, every layer intentional, every surface chosen for what it would do with heat. She stood there in the near dark in the silence of the limestone, and she thought about Thomas pressing his palm against this same rock 2 years ago. This stone has been warm longer than any house I have ever been in. She put her hand on the back wall, the cold limestone, and held it there. Then she went back down the hill to get the children. November 9th, 1890. That was the day Clara Marsh moved Anna and Daniel into the cave. They carried what mattered: blankets, a small table, 2 chairs, and a trunk of clothes. The cooking pots, Clara's sewing kit, and her remaining mending work. The mercury thermometer that had belonged to her father, a small brass-cased instrument he had used for surveying elevations, and that she had kept because it was his and because it was accurate. Anna was quiet during the move, which was her way of processing things she was uncertain about. She looked at the cave entrance without expression and carried her blanket roll inside without being asked twice. Daniel asked twice whether there would be spiders, and once told that the inner walls had been sealed against them, accepted the situation with the adaptable practicality of a 6-year-old who had already learned that the world rearranged itself without asking permission. Clara built the first fire in the masonry stove that evening. 3 split logs, the kind of modest load her cabin fireplace would have burned through in an hour without noticeably warming the room. She lit the kindling and watched the draft catch, watched the smoke pull upward through the channels and out through the fissure in the cave ceiling, clean and without backflow. She closed the firebox door and waited. The thermometer read 44 degrees when she lit the fire. After 1 hour, it read 58. After 2 hours, 62. She put the children to bed at their usual time. Anna curled under her blankets with the quick surrender to sleep that healthy children have. Daniel was asleep before Clara finished tucking the edge of his blanket against the wall. Neither child was shivering. Clara sat down at the small table with the shirt she was currently hemming and the lamp burning close and the masonry stove putting out its steady, unremarkable heat, and she sewed for an hour without noticing that her fingers were warm. That was the thing she remembered afterward when people asked her what the first night had been like. Not the temperature, not the silence of the cave around her, or the weight of everything she had lost and rebuilt in the 8 months since March. She remembered that she had sewn for a full hour without noticing that her fingers were warm. In the cabin, she had always noticed, cold finds the hands first, the tips of the fingers, the place where the needle meets the fabric. She had sewn through 3 Montana winters, noticing every time her hands were cold, compensating, adjusting, working around the stiffness that came and went with the drafts through the cabin walls. Here she just sewed. Outside, the November wind was working through the Douglas fir, on the ridge above the cave, moving through the frozen dark with its usual indifference. The limestone absorbed it. The double walls ignored it. The stone floor gave back the heat it had been collecting since mid-morning when the masonry stove first came to life. Clara finished the hem, set the shirt aside, and checked the thermometer before going to bed. 64 degrees. The fire had been burning on its own for 3 hours with no additional wood. She looked at that number for a long time. Then she turned down the lamp and went to sleep. December came and went without drama. The settlement moved through the early winter in the ordinary way, banking fires against the cold that deepened week by week, stacking additional wood against the north walls of cabins, pulling heavier curtains across windows that had begun to frost at the edges. Children wore more layers. Men split wood in the mornings before the temperature dropped to its daily low. The rhythm was familiar, the same rhythm that had governed winter life in this part of Montana since the first structures went up on the plains west of the river. Clara moved through December at a different rhythm. She burned 2 logs in the morning, sometimes 3, if she was cooking something that required sustained heat. She added 1 log in the evening before the children went to sleep. The masonry stove's stone mass, fully heated now, after 6 weeks of daily fires, held the main shelter above 70 degrees through every night without additional wood. The vestibule temperature ran between 50 and 55, which was cold but not dangerously so, and served its purpose of breaking the outdoor air before it reached the inner door. She kept records in the small ledger on the table. Date, outside temperature from the vestibule thermometer, inside a temperature from the main room thermometer, logs burned, sewing work completed. It was the same kind of careful accounting she applied to her income and expenses, the systematic attention of a woman who understood that information was a resource like wood or flour, something that needed to be gathered and kept and used deliberately. By mid-December, she had burned through less than a quarter of a cord since November 9th. She did not mention this to anyone. There was no one to mention it to in a way that would be useful. The people who had formed opinions about her choices in September were not going to revise those opinions based on her word. The numbers would have to speak for themselves, and for that they needed a witness. The witness came in January. The cold did not arrive the way cold usually arrives in Montana. It did not come gradually tightening its grip over a series of weeks. The way the seasons normally moved, giving people time to adjust, to add wood to the pile, to stuff more rags into the gaps under the doors. It did not give warning in the way that experienced men expected warning, through the slow dropping of the mercury over several days, through the thickening of ice on the river's edges, through the progressive shortening of the hours when a man could work outside without his breath freezing on his beard. It came in a single night, January 6, 1891. The temperature dropped 28 degrees in 6 hours. By midnight, the mercury hit 18 below 0 Fahrenheit. By dawn, it was 26 below, and the wind out of the northwest was steady and hard, the kind of wind that does not gust and pause, the way ordinary winter wind does, but simply presses constant and without fatigue against every surface it finds. It found the north walls of every cabin in the settlement. It found the gaps around every window frame, the spaces under every door, the slight imperfections in every chimney joint where the mortar had aged and contracted. It found all of them, and it did not stop. Inside the cave on the morning of January 7th, Clara fed 3 logs to the masonry stove and noted the outside temperature from the second thermometer she had mounted near the vestibule entrance. -22. She noted it in her ledger in the same hand she used for everything, the same column beside the inside temperature reading and the log count. Inside temperature at dawn, 71 degrees. She started the children's breakfast. Utipament. For the first 3 days, the settlement managed. Cabins in Montana were built for Montana winters. The men who had constructed them were not naive about what the climate required, and most of the structures in the settlement had thick log walls, heavy stoves, and owners who had stockpiled what they believed were adequate wood supplies. 12 cords was considered a responsible winter reserve. Some families had more. The cold was severe, but severity was not novel, and the initial response of most people was to burn more wood, bank the fires higher, and wait for the temperature to rise. By January 9th, 3 days in, it had not risen. It had dropped 2 more degrees. The wood consumption that had seemed manageable on January 6th now looked different. A family burning a cord every 10 days in a normal winter was burning through a cord every 4 days in this one. The math was not complicated, and it was not reassuring. A man who had laid in 12 cords, thinking he had until mid-March, now looked at his woodpile and saw February perhaps. Late February if he was disciplined and lucky. The price of firewood in the settlements, where there was still any surplus to sell, tripled within a week. Men who had sold their extra cords in December at fair prices had no way to buy them back at any price because the men they had sold to were not selling. Everyone was holding what they had. Chimneys that had drawn cleanly for years began to fail. The extreme cold created temperature differentials so severe that stone chimney liners cracked under the thermal stress, the way a glass cracks when you pour boiling water into it too fast. Smoke that had always risen cleanly began to backdraft into rooms, filling the lower portions of cabins with a gray haze that made eyes water and lungs ache. Families woke in the night, coughing, stumbling toward doors to get air, losing heat through those open doors faster than they could replace it. In the Gunderson cabin a mile south of the main settlement, Jonas Gunderson was burning 8 logs before breakfast, simply to keep the interior temperature above freezing. His wife told a neighbor that they were going through a cord every 4 days and that her children were sleeping in a pile with hot stones wrapped in cloth pressed against their backs. "We will not make it to March," she said, and she did not sound like a woman who was exaggerating. The Alderman household ran short on lamp oil in the second week and had to manage evenings by firelight alone, which meant the fire had to burn brighter and hotter to provide both heat and light, which meant the wood went faster, which meant the man of the house was splitting fence rails by the 14th because there was nothing else left to split. 3 families on the western edge of the settlement had not planned for a winter this severe and found themselves out of options by the second week. They moved in with relatives, crowding into spaces that were already strained, sharing heat and food, and the particular tension that prolonged close quarters produces in people who love each other under ordinary conditions. The cold did not care about any of this. It continued doing what it had been doing since January 6th, pressing against every surface it found patient and without interruption. Roy Dunbar's chimney cracked on the night of January 15th. He heard it happen. A sound like a rifle shot from inside the wall, followed by the particular quality of silence that means something has changed and not for the better. He was out of bed in seconds, his wife Martha beside him, and within minutes the smell of the smoke in the main room confirmed what the sound had suggested. The stone liner had split. Smoke was escaping the flue at the point of the crack and entering the wall cavity, and from there it was finding its way into the room through every small gap and imperfection in the interior finish. He had the fire out within the hour, which meant that the room temperature, which had been a marginal 52 degrees, began falling immediately. By 2 in the morning it was 40 degrees, by 3:34. Roy Dunbar stood in his cold main room in the dark, his breath visible in the beam of his lantern, and he made the practical decision that his pride would allow him to make. He woke his 3 children and his wife Martha, and moved all of them to his neighbor's house. The alderman place 200 yards south, where the chimney was intact and the fire was still going, and there was floor space enough for 5 more people if they did not mind the crowding. He did not go to Clara Marsh. The choice was not complicated in his mind. He had stated publicly that her plan was foolish, that the cave would flood or suffocate or fail in some way that would harm her children, and prove the point that unconventional thinking about shelter was not wisdom but desperation dressed up as ingenuity. He had said these things in front of men whose respect he valued. Going to the cave now with his own chimney cracked and his family displaced would have required him to become a different kind of man than he believed himself to be. So he went to the alderman's and he lay on their floor in his coat and listened to the wind, and he did not sleep much. Erskine Pruitt, the settlement's most experienced trapper, was the one who later told people about Roy's cracked chimney, not with any malice, just with the matter-of-fact accuracy of a man who traded in precise information because his life had always depended on it. Pruitt had been out checking his trap line on the morning of January 16th, the day after the chimney cracked, and he had passed the Dunbar house and seen the cold chimney, the unlighted windows, the tracks in the snow, heading south toward the Alderman place. He put it together without needing anyone to explain it to him. He did not mention the connection to Clara Marsh's cave, not in that telling. He simply described what he had seen with the neutral precision of a man reporting weather conditions. But the people listening made the connection themselves quietly, without saying it out loud, because the contrast was too obvious to miss and too uncomfortable to name directly. Reverend Samuel Fitch had been making his rounds for 11 days when he added Clara Marsh to his list on the morning of January 19th. She had not been on the list earlier, which was itself a kind of statement about how the settlement thought of her situation. The people on Fitch's list were the ones assumed to be struggling: the elderly, the sick, the families whose wood supplies were known to be thin. Clara had not been placed in that category, partly because she was considered capable, and partly because her unconventional housing choice had, in the minds of most people, already placed her outside the normal categories of concern. If she was foolish enough to put her children in a cave, she was on her own. That was not said directly because the community's sense of decency prevented direct cruelty, but it was the operating assumption. Fitch added her to the list because he was a methodical man and because 11 days of sustained negative temperatures had made him unwilling to operate on assumptions. He had seen too much in 11 days. He had helped carry wood to the Hendersons when their supply ran out. He had sat with the Garrity children while their mother dealt with smoke inhalation from a backdrafted chimney. He had helped Jonas Gunderson patch a cracked window frame with rags and pine pitch at midnight, standing in the open in -25, his fingers going numb through his gloves. He was not willing to assume Clara Marsh was fine. He was going to go and see. He climbed the slope to the cave in the mid-morning of January 19th, his satchel over his shoulder, his boots punching through the frozen crust with each step. The wind had dropped slightly since dawn, but slightly in this context meant the difference between unbearable and merely brutal. He kept his head down and climbed. He noticed the smoke from the fissure above the cave, that thin thread of gray against the white sky. He noticed the strange stillness of the air near the cave entrance. He called out and Clara appeared, and he saw what he saw, and then he was inside, standing in front of a thermometer reading 82 degrees, while the world outside sat at -21. They talked for 20 minutes. "How much wood are you using?" he asked. "2 logs a day, sometimes 3. He did the calculation again, the same one he had done in his head, on the walk up, wanting to be sure he was not making an arithmetic error. 2 logs a day. The families he had been visiting were burning between 8 and 14 logs a day to achieve temperatures between 40 and 55 degrees. Clara was burning 2 and maintaining 82. He asked about the heat retention, and she showed him the firebox with its fading coals from the morning's 3 logs. She explained the channels, the serpentine path the heat traveled before escaping the way the stone mass absorbed it at every turn. She showed him the double walls, the dead air trapped between the layers, the floor stones releasing their accumulated warmth beneath the elevated planks. She walked him to the back wall, the radiant limestone face she had packed with river stones or mortared in clay, and pressed her palm against it. "Feel that," she said. He put his hand on the stone. It was warm. Not the surface warmth of a wall near a fire, but a deeper stored warmth, the warmth of something that had been absorbing heat for weeks and was still giving it back. "How long has this wall been holding heat?" he asked. "Since the first fire in November," she said. "The stone doesn't forget quickly." Fitch looked at the thermometer for a long time. Then he said quietly, without any particular drama, "Roy Dunbar is burning 12 logs a day." He had not planned to say it. It came out of the arithmetic, out of the comparison that had been building in his mind since he walked through the door, out of 11 days of watching the settlement struggle with something that was not struggling here. Clara looked at him without expression. The silence after that statement was one of the most precise silences Fitch had ever experienced. There was nothing to add to it. The numbers sat in the warm air of the cave and explained themselves without assistance. He left without touching the supplies in his satchel. He stood on the slope for a moment in the wind, looking at that thin line of smoke above the cave. Then he walked directly to Roy Dunbar's house, or to the Alderman house where Roy was currently staying, and he told Roy what he had seen. "You need to see this," he said. Roy was feeding a borrowed iron stove that was keeping one room of the Alderman house at 48 degrees despite burning steadily for hours. He looked up at Fitch with the particular irritation of a man who had been uncomfortable for 11 days and was not interested in information that would require him to revise his thinking. "I am not interested in hearing about cave living." "Reverend," he said. "She is maintaining 80 degrees with 2 logs a day," Fitch said. Roy stopped moving. The log was still in his hand. "That is not possible," he said. "I saw the thermometer. I felt the heat. She is burning a tenth of what you are using and staying twice as warm." Roy set the log down on top of the stove rather than into it, a small, automatic gesture that meant something was happening in his thinking that required him to stop for a moment. He did not say anything else while Fitch was in the room. He picked the log back up after a while and put it in the stove, and Fitch let himself out into the cold. Martha Dunbar came to the cave on the night of January 20th. She came alone without telling Roy at 10 o'clock in the evening, when the temperature outside had dropped to -28, and her youngest daughter, 4-year-old Frances, had been feverish since midday. The Alderman house, with its one functioning fireplace keeping the main room at a marginal 50 degrees, was managing the cold but not managing a sick child. Frances had been coughing since the afternoon, a dry, persistent sound that a mother learns to distinguish from ordinary, coughing the kind with an edge to it that means the body is working too hard. Martha had spent the afternoon watching her daughter and making a calculation that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with the terror of a parent watching a child's color go wrong in bad light. She put on her heaviest coat and her husband's work gloves, and she walked up the ridge in the dark with Frances wrapped against her chest. She knocked on the outer door of the vestibule. Clara opened it within seconds. She looked at Martha, then at the bundle against Martha's chest, and stepped back to let them in without asking a single question. Inside, the warmth closed around them immediately. Martha did not have the presence of mind to register a temperature or think about thermal principles. She was a mother with a sick child who had just stepped out of -28 degrees, and what she felt was simply that her daughter could breathe here, that the air itself was different, that the coughing, which had been tight and effortful outside, was already easing as Frances's small body stopped working against the cold. She sat down in the chair Clara guided her to and held Frances while the child's breathing gradually steadied. Anna and Daniel, who had been asleep, stirred briefly and then settled back without fully waking. The masonry stove held its heat with the patient reliability of a thing built correctly for a single purpose. Martha stayed 3 days. She did not send word to Roy. Roy did not come. The arrangement existed in a space that neither of them acknowledged, a silence that served everyone by not being broken. Clara gave Martha the small cot she herself had been sleeping on and took the floor. She made room for Frances beside Anna under the blankets. The cave held its temperature through all 3 nights, never dropping below 72, while outside the temperature swung between -22 and -31. Frances's fever broke on the 2nd day. By the 3rd morning, she was sitting up and reaching for Daniel's carved wooden animals, and the terrible focused vigilance that parents maintain over sick children began to ease in Martha's face. Color came back. Appetite returned. The child, who had been frighteningly still, was fidgeting again, which is the most reassuring thing a sick child can do. On the morning of the 4th day, Martha prepared to take Frances back down the hill. Clara was at the sewing table when Martha came to say goodbye, working on a shirt with the focused economy of movement that skilled needlework requires. She set the shirt down and stood up. Martha started to say something and did not quite get there. The gap between what she wanted to say and what the past 11 days had made difficult to say was wider than she could cross in a single moment. There were no words available in the ordinary vocabulary of the settlement for a situation like this one, where gratitude and history and the specific complications of whose wife she was had all tangled together into something that resisted simple expression. Clara crossed it for her. She went to the small writing shelf mounted beside the stove, took a folded piece of paper from beneath the ledger, and held it out to Martha. Martha unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn diagram, detailed and precise in the way that Clara's sewing work was precise, every line intentional. It showed the layout of the masonry stove channels, the dimensions of the double wall construction, the placement of the stone floor, and the elevated plank surface above it, the position and depth of the vestibule airlock. Beside each element, Clara had written brief notes in her small, even hand. Measurements, materials. The logic behind each choice stated plainly. This is everything, Clara said. You do not need a cave. The same principles work in any structure with enough mass and sealed walls. It takes time to build correctly, but it works. Martha looked at the diagram for a moment. Then she folded it carefully, the way you fold something you intend to keep. She took Frances down the hill without looking back. Roy found the diagram in the kitchen drawer on a Saturday afternoon in late January, 3 days after Martha and Frances came home. He had not been looking for it. He opened the drawer for a pencil, and the folded paper was there, and he took it out and opened it because he did not know what it was. He stood at the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. The drawings were clear. The dimensions were specific. The notes beside each element were brief and practical, written in the hand of someone who understood what they were writing about, not explaining for admiration, but recording the way you record something that works so that it can be used again. He recognized the masonry stove design from the description Fitch had given him. He recognized the double wall principle as something he had encountered in older construction manuals. German and Scandinavian building guides approaches he had considered impractical for American lumber costs and construction schedules. Standing here now in a kitchen that was 48 degrees despite a fire that had been burning since dawn, those objections felt thinner than they had in September. He folded the paper and put it back in the drawer. He did not say anything to Martha about it. He did not say anything to anyone, but he did not throw it away. By the last week of January 1891, 12 people had visited the cave. They came in ones and twos, some openly, some in the early morning before the rest of the settlement was moving. A few came because Reverend Fitch had told them what he had seen. A few came because Erskine Pruitt had mentioned it with his characteristic neutral accuracy, letting the facts carry their own weight. One family came because their wood supply had dropped to 2 cords, and they needed to know whether what they had heard was true before they made decisions they could not undo. Each of them experienced the same sequence. The vestibule warmth immediate and steady, the thermometer reading between 78 and 84, the masonry stove with its modest fire or its quietly glowing coals, Clara at the sewing table or moving between the stove and the children with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had nothing left to prove and nothing to perform. Each of them asked different questions that were really the same question. How is this possible? And Clara answered each time the same way she had answered Fitch. Not with pride, not with the eagerness of someone waiting to be vindicated, with information, with physics, with the patient explanation of someone who built something because she needed it to work, and it did, and now other people needed to understand it because their need was as real as hers had been. The numbers that circulated through the settlement in the last days of January were not dramatic in their presentation. They moved the way practical knowledge moves in communities where survival is a shared condition, person to person, in the specific language of people comparing notes on what is and is not working. Average cabin temperature during the sustained freeze, 45 to 55 degrees, achieved by burning between 6 and 14 logs per day. Clara Marsh's cave shelter, 78 to 84 degrees, burning 2 to 3 logs per day. Heat retention after fire died, cabins dropped below freezing in 2 to 3 hours. The cave shelter held above 65 for 8 hours or more and maintained 51 degrees with no fire at all, drawing on the thermal mass accumulated over weeks of heated occupation. Wood consumption through January, most families in the settlement had burned through 4 to 5 cords. Clara Marsh had burned through less than half a cord. These were not inspiring numbers in the way that speeches are inspiring. They were precise and undeniable in the way that cold is precise and undeniable. And they moved through the community the same way the cold had moved through it, finding every gap in the assumption that the current way of doing things was the only way. Not everyone came. Pride kept some away. Certainty kept others. The discomfort of being wrong about something you had stated publicly kept at least one man at home feeding his borrowed stove and keeping his own counsel. But enough came, and that was enough. Through all of it, Clara sat at her sewing table in the warm cave hemming shirts for loggers and turning collars on coats for the families who brought their mending up the hill, doing the work that paid for flour and salt and the modest life she was rebuilding for herself and her children. The masonry stove held its heat through every night of that January. The thermometer never dropped below 71. Outside, the temperature did not rise above zero for 19 consecutive days, the longest such stretch anyone in the county could remember. The winter of 1890 to 1891 would be recorded in the county annals as the coldest sustained cold event since 1846. Inside the cave, Anna finished a sampler she had been embroidering since November. Daniel learned to play a simple game with the carved wooden animals that Erskine Pruitt had brought as a gift during his visit. Clara finished 11 shirts, 2 coats, and a dress that had needed extensive reconstruction, and she recorded each completed job in her ledger beside the daily temperature readings and the wood consumption numbers. She had proven it to herself on November 9th when the thermometer read 64 degrees and her children slept through the night without shivering. Everything that happened after that was the world catching up to something she already knew. The cold broke on February 3rd, 1891, not with drama, not with the theater that severe weather sometimes uses when it releases its grip. It simply moderated the way most things eventually moderate by degrees across several days until the mercury climbed back to single digits above zero, and men could work outside for more than 20 minutes without their fingers going dangerously numb. The settlement emerged from the sustained freeze, the way people emerge from any prolonged ordeal, cautiously taking inventory, not quite trusting the change yet. Men went to their wood piles and counted what remained. Women opened windows that had been sealed since early January and let relatively warmer air move through rooms that had accumulated weeks of smoke and lamp oil and the specific staleness of sealed spaces in crisis. Children who had been kept indoors ran outside and immediately fell in the snow and were called back in and ran out again. The accounting began quietly, the way accounting always begins, person by person, household by household, each family working out privately what the winter had cost them. The Gunderson family had burned through 11 cords since November. They had planned for 12, considered it a comfortable margin, and were now looking at a remaining supply that would need to stretch through at least 6 more weeks of cold weather. Jonas Gunderson spent a long Sunday afternoon in early February splitting everything he could find that was splittable: fence rails, the back wall of a deteriorating outbuilding, a pile of old lumber he had been saving for a project that now seemed less urgent than staying warm. The Alderman household had burned through 9 cords. 3 other families had exhausted their supplies entirely during the worst of the freeze and had survived the final 2 weeks through the charity of neighbors who could spare wood only by accepting that their own margins were now uncomfortably thin. 2 families had dismantled portions of their outbuildings for fuel. One man had burned a fence line he had spent the previous summer building, pulling the posts and rails apart in the dark at midnight, feeding them to a stove that was keeping his children warm at the cost of a boundary he would spend the following summer rebuilding. Clara Marsh had used 4.5 cords of wood across the entire winter. She had 3 cords remaining from her original supply. This fact did not announce itself. Clara did not go to the general store and make a statement about it, and the ledger was private, a record for herself. The number became known the way significant numbers become known in small communities through the unavoidable transparency of daily life. People saw how infrequently the handcart went up the ridge. People noticed that the thin thread of smoke above the cave fissure remained thin even through the worst nights. Erskine Pruitt, who tracked everything in the landscape around him as a professional habit, mentioned to 2 people that he had counted Clara's wood trips in January, and the number was surprisingly small, and those 2 people mentioned it to others. By the first week of February, the differential was understood. In September, people had asked what Clara Marsh was thinking. In February, people started asking how she had done it. Erskine Pruitt was the first to make a direct change. He was not a man given to elaborate deliberation. He was 35 years old, lean, and weathered in the way that men who work outside in Montana become lean and weathered, and he had survived long enough in the backcountry to develop a reliable instinct for identifying what worked and discarding what did not. He had visited the cave in late January, asked Clara precise questions about the wall insulation, taken mental measurements, and left without fanfare. In the first week of February, while the weather was still cold enough to require serious heating, he packed the gap between his cabin's north-facing wall and an exterior lean-to with dried moss, compressing it into the space with a wooden tamper until it formed a dense insulating layer. He sealed the gaps with clay mixed with pine needle material. The interior temperature on the north side of his cabin rose by 12 degrees within 2 days with no change in his wood consumption. 12 degrees in a winter where 12 degrees was the difference between manageable and dangerous, between sleeping through the night and waking at 3 in the morning to feed a failing stove. 12 degrees was not a marginal improvement. It was a meaningful one. Pruitt told the two people he trusted most with practical information, and by mid-February, a working knowledge of the insulation principle was moving through the settlement. Helga Strand came to the cave in early March when the worst of the winter had passed, but the lessons of January were still raw enough to be motivating. She was 38 years old, Norwegian by birth, practical in the deeply specific way of people who come from places where the relationship between good construction and survival has been understood for generations. She had come to Montana with her husband Arvad 12 years earlier, and they had built a sod house on their homestead that had served adequately in most winters, but had failed badly in this one, leaking meltwater through the roof in the warmer spells, and losing heat through the earth walls at a rate that had kept them burning wood at a pace that exhausted their supply. She walked through the cave shelter slowly, the way a craftsperson walks through another craftsperson's workshop, touching the double walls, running her fingers along the mortar joints of the masonry stove, crouching to examine the gap between the stone floor and the elevated plank surface. She measured the vestibule dimensions with a length of rope she had brought for exactly that purpose. She stood in the center of the main shelter for a long time without speaking. "We built for Norwegian winters," she finally said quietly. "We did not think to build differently for a Montana one." Clara looked at her steadily. "The materials are different here," she said. "The stone is different. What works in one place needs adjusting for another." "You would have worked it out." Helga shook her head slowly. "We had the knowledge," she said. "We just did not think to apply it this way." She looked at the back wall, the radiant stone face Clara had built against the cave's natural limestone. "We thought the problem was the cold. You understood the problem was the heat. How to keep what you already made." Clara considered that for a moment. "That is exactly right," she said. Helga's husband Arvid came 2 days later and asked about adapting the principles to an above-ground structure. He was a careful builder with good instincts, and he understood immediately that the thermal mass principle did not require a cave only sufficient density and insulation to hold what heat a fire produced, rather than letting it escape through thin walls and a drafty chimney. Clara sketched on a piece of flat slate with a chalk pencil how to create thermal mass with a stone floor in a wood frame structure, how to position a masonry stove at the interior center of a building rather than against an exterior wall so that its heat radiated inward rather than bleeding through the wall behind it, how to frame a double wall with an insulating mount using the materials available at any lumber yard in the territory. Arvid listened and asked questions and listened again the way a man listens when he is not waiting for a chance to talk but actually taking in information he intends to use. The Strands rebuilt their home the following summer. The first winter in the new structure, they burned 60% less wood than their previous average and maintained interior temperatures that allowed them to work and eat and sleep without the constant management of a failing heating system that had defined their Montana winters until then. Winifred Crail incorporated the double wall principle into the design of the new schoolhouse when the settlement built it in 1892. The decision was not dramatic or publicly attributed. The school board discussed construction materials and gauze, and Winifred made specific recommendations about wall framing and stove placement that added a modest amount to the construction cost and were accepted without much debate because Winifred had been the settlement's teacher for 12 years, and her practical judgment was trusted on matters within her experience. The new schoolhouse opened in October of 1892. By December, something was happening in it that was remarkable, precisely because it was not remarkable to the children inside, who simply arrived in the morning and removed their coats and sat down and learned. In the old schoolhouse, children had kept their coats on through December and January. The building had been cold enough that Winifred had moved the students through brief physical exercises every hour to maintain circulation, a workaround she had developed out of necessity, and that had always struck her as evidence of a problem that should have been solvable. In the new schoolhouse, they took their coats off. That was the change. Simple, unglamorous, the kind of improvement that is easy to overlook precisely because the problem it solves no longer exists to remind you of itself. The firewood budget for the school dropped by roughly half. Children stopped getting sick in February at the rate they had been getting sick. Winifred taught through the winter of 1892 to 1893 without once conducting the circulation exercises because circulation was not a problem that needed solving when the room was warm. She knew where the solution had come from. She had been the first person to ask Clara directly about the source of her knowledge, and she had understood the answer, and she had carried it forward without ceremony or announcement, which was exactly how Clara had carried it forward herself. Roy Dunbar did not visit the cave. Not in February, not in March, not in the spring of 1891, when the snow melted and the Milk River ran high and fast and cold, and the settlement began the long process of assessing what the winter had cost. He did not visit in the summer when the memory of the freeze was present enough to be motivating, but the immediate pressure had eased enough to make delay feel acceptable. He rebuilt his cracked chimney in April with careful attention to the thermal expansion joints that had failed, using a technique he described to his neighbor as something he should have done the first time. He did not explain where he had developed the opinion that thermal expansion joints mattered. He began framing his next client's cabin in May of 1891. The design included a double wall on the north and west faces with a 4-inch insulating gap packed with dry material between the layers. The stove was positioned at the interior center of the main room rather than against the north wall, which was where he had always put stoves before. The entrance had a small enclosed vestibule 5 feet deep that would buffer the main living space from the cold that entered every time the door was open. His client, a rancher named Fielding, who was expanding his property, commented that the design looked different from the cabins Dunbar had built before. Thermal efficiency, Roy said, basic physics. He picked up his framing square and moved on to the next measurement. Fielding did not press further. The cabin was completed in August, and Fielding's family moved in before the first frost. They reported that first winter that the structure was the warmest they had ever lived in, and that their wood consumption was roughly half what they had budgeted for. Word moved through the settlement's building community with the quiet efficiency that practical knowledge moves when it produces undeniable results. Men who hired Dunbar for construction work in 1892 and 1893 received structures built on the same principles. Men who noticed the results and asked questions received explanations framed in terms of thermal efficiency and building physics accurate in every technical detail that did not include the name Clara Marsh. The tattered diagram remained in the kitchen drawer. Martha knew it was there. She had put it there. She opened the drawer periodically for various reasons and saw it each time: the folded paper, Clara's precise small handwriting, the careful diagrams that had grown more creased as the months passed. The paper was unfolding and refolding itself, or someone was doing it for her, and she did not ask who, and Roy did not offer to say. She left it where it was. Some things are kept rather than resolved, stored in the silence that long marriages develop around the points where pride and gratitude and obligation cannot be easily separated from one another. The diagram was one of those things. It stayed in the drawer through 1892 and 1893 and beyond, and Roy Dunbar built 11 structures in the 4 years following the winter of 1891, every one of them warmer and more efficient than anything he had built before. By 1895, 4 years after the winter that had tested everything, an estimated 37 homes and structures within a 50-mile radius of the settlement had incorporated techniques derived from what Clara had built in that cave. The changes were not uniform. Some people had adopted the full system: masonry stoves, double-wall stone thermal mass vestibule entries. Others had taken pieces, adding insulation layers to existing walls, repositioning fireplaces toward the interior building, simple airlock entries to reduce heat loss through frequently used doors. A rancher named Beaumont, who could not modify his existing structure without rebuilding entirely, constructed a small masonry heater in his barn using Clara's stove design, and reported that his horses came through the following 2 winters without the losses to cold exposure that had been a regular cost of his operation. The cumulative effect, measured in the practical currency of the frontier, was significant. Average winter wood consumption in the area dropped by an estimated 28%. Families reported fewer illnesses in the coldest months. Children slept through nights that had previously required parents to wake and tend fires every 2 hours. The incremental improvements in daily comfort represented something larger than comfort. They represented a fundamental shift in the amount of human energy that winter consumed, energy that could now be directed toward work and children and the ordinary maintenance of life rather than toward the constant management of inadequate heat. Clara herself did not measure or catalog these things. She was aware in the way a person is aware of changes in a community they live closely within, that things were different than they had been, that certain conversations about wood and cold and building had changed in character. She noticed without making note of it, the way you notice that the light has changed in the afternoon without writing it down. She was busy. She was always busy. The sewing work continued, and in 1892 and 1893, it expanded slightly, partly because her reputation for quality and reliability had grown, and partly because several families who had visited the cave and taken what they found there seriously had become steady customers, suggesting the connection between gratitude and commerce that communities rarely articulate but frequently practice. She lived in the cave for 6 years through the winter of 1896, when Anna was 15 and Daniel was 12, and the cave's dimensions, which had felt adequate for 3 people in 1890, had begun to feel genuinely small for 3 people whose bodies and lives had grown into their adolescent shapes. In the spring of 1897, Clara bought a small house in town. It was not an impressive structure, a story and a half, 4 rooms, a yard that needed clearing, a chimney that drew adequately but not well. She paid for it with 6 years of sewing income managed with the careful precision of a woman who had learned exactly how much margin she required and how little waste she could afford. She spent the summer of 1897 improving it. The north wall got a double layer, the gap packed with the same moss and pine needle insulation she had used in the cave. She replaced the open fireplace with a masonry stove she built herself over 8 weekends, using fire brick traded for 3 months of mending work. She laid stone on the floor of the main room and covered it with plank flooring on low sleepers, the same principle as the cave cold air settling below the living surface. She built a small vestibule onto the front entry, nothing elaborate, just enough depth to break the cold air before it reached the main door. The first winter in the house, she burned 3 cords of wood. A house that size, built the conventional way, would have required 8. She noted the numbers in her ledger with the same neutral precision she had always used. Not satisfaction, exactly. Not pride, which had never been much of a motivation for her. Something closer to the quiet confirmation that comes when something you understood theoretically turns out to be true in practice again, in a different place with different materials, under different conditions. The principle held. It always held. That was the nature of a principle. The years between 1897 and 1903 were the quietest of Clara's life since before Thomas died, which is to say they were busy and modest and unremarkable in the way that good lives often are from the outside. Anna grew into a capable young woman who had inherited her mother's practical intelligence and applied it to different problems. She married a man named Calloway from Billings in 1904 and moved south, and the distance between them was the particular distance that opens when children become adults and begin the separate lives they were always going to live. Clara accepted it with the same even temperament she applied to most things, not without feeling, but without drama. Daniel stayed closer. He had his father's quietness and his mother's observational precision, a combination that made him effective in the outdoor work he gravitated toward, trapping and ranching and the various manual occupations that the Montana landscape offered to young men who were willing to learn what it required. He knew the ridge country west of town as well as anyone living, having spent 6 years of his childhood inside it. Clara sewed. She tended her stove and her garden. She read her father's books and occasionally acquired new ones. She tracked her ledger with the same discipline she had always maintained. She was, by any external measure, a settled and ordinary woman, living a settled and ordinary life in a settlement that was gradually becoming less of a settlement and more of a town. The cave sat on the hillside west of town and did what limestone does. It held its temperature. It stayed dry. Trappers and hunters used it in bad weather, finding it consistently warmer than the air outside and drier than any other shelter in the ridge country. Some of them knew whose work they were benefiting from. Some of them did not. The cave itself did not distinguish between them. She was not in the cave when the geologist came. It was December of 1903, 12 years after the winter that had built the cave's reputation, and 6 years after Clara had moved into town. The geologist was a professor from the University of Montana, a methodical man in his 40s named Aldous Caverly, who had come to the area to study limestone formation patterns in the ridge system west of the settlement. His local guide was Daniel Marsh. Daniel was 19 years old in December of 1903, tall in the way his father had been tall, quiet in a way that was his own, developed from his particular combination of temperament and history, rather than inherited from either parent directly. He had agreed to guide Caverly for a reasonable daily rate without particular curiosity about what the professor was looking for. He led Caverly along the ridge system through the morning, stopping when the geologist wanted to stop moving, when the geologist was ready to move, saying what was useful and nothing more. In the early afternoon, they reached the cave. Caverly noticed it with the alert attention of a man trained to see geological features rather than simply walk past them. He asked Daniel what it was, and Daniel said it was a limestone cavern said to extend about 40 feet into the ridge. They went in. The entrance was as it had always been, narrow, southeast facing, sheltered by the Douglas fir on the slope above. Inside, the structural evidence of what Clara had built was still present, the timber framing of the inner room now weathered, but intact, the masonry stove against the back wall, the stone floor, the remnants of the double wall construction. 12 years of intermittent use by passing trappers and hunters had not destroyed the wooden elements. The structure was recognizable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Caverly was thinking about limestone formation when he entered, but he was a careful observer, and he registered what was in front of him with the automatic precision of a scientist who catalogs everything he encounters. He set up his instruments. He took his measurements. He did what he had come to do. And then, because it was December and he had instruments and he was a man who measured things, he measured the cave temperature. He set the thermometer and waited. Outside, the air temperature was 19 degrees Fahrenheit. A cold December afternoon, not extreme by Montana standards, but genuinely cold. The kind of cold that shortens your stride and makes you want to get inside. The thermometer inside the cave read 51 degrees. Caverly looked at it for a long moment. He looked at the rock around him, the dense limestone, the sealed inner room with its remnant insulation, the masonry stove that had not been fired in years. He looked at the stone floor, still laid in its careful overlapping pattern, still mortared with clay that had dried to the hardness of low-grade concrete. He took out his field journal and wrote. The handwriting was compact and precise. The handwriting of a man who wrote in the field conditions where space and time were limited. He wrote that the cave exhibited remarkable thermal retention properties attributable to the combination of natural limestone insulation and deliberate structural modifications by a former occupant. He wrote that the temperature differential between the interior and exterior represented a degree of heat retention that exceeded what natural cave formation alone would produce. He wrote that the occupant had demonstrated an understanding of thermal mass and insulation principles that compared favorably to formal engineering practice. He did not record a name because he did not have one. He asked Daniel if he knew who had built the interior structure. Daniel looked at the masonry stove, cold now, unfired for years, but still structurally intact. He looked at the stone floor. The careful overlapping pattern, the elevated plank surface above it, most of the planks still in place, though some had warped and split across 12 winters of temperature variation. He looked at the back wall, the radiant stone face his mother had built from river stones mortared in clay, the surface she had explained to him when he was 6 years old as a wall that remembers warmth. A woman who used to live here, he said. Caverly made a brief note. A woman. Former occupant. Unknown. He moved on to his limestone measurements. Daniel stood near the entrance of the cave while the geologist worked. He remembered the night they moved to November 9th, 1890. He had been 6 years old and he had asked about spiders and then forgotten about spiders almost immediately because the cave was warm and his mother had made a fire and his sister Anna had organized their blankets in a way that made them feel like a proper bed rather than a pile of cloth on the floor of a hole in a hillside. He remembered waking up that first morning and not being cold. That was the specific memory, the absence of the thing that had always been present before. The cold that found you in the morning before you were fully awake, that came through the blankets and the wool socks and the layers his mother piled on them every night in the cabin. Persistent and unavoidable, a fact of winter mornings that he had accepted as simply the way mornings were. That first morning in the cave, he had woken up and not been cold, and he had lain there for a few minutes in the warmth, not quite understanding what was different. And then he had understood, and he had pulled the blanket down from his face and looked at the stone ceiling above him and thought in the direct language of a 6-year-old that this was better. He had never told his mother about that specific memory. It seemed like a thing she already knew. Caverly finished his measurements, packed his instruments, and thanked Daniel for his guidance, and they left the cave and walked back down the ridge toward the settlement in the pale December light. Daniel did not mention his mother's name. He was not entirely sure why. It was not a secret. Anyone in the settlement who had been there in 1891 knew who had built the cave shelter, knew the story in the imprecise but generally accurate way that community stories survive, blurred at the edges, accurate at the center. He could have said, "My mother built that. She was 32 years old and widowed, and she had 2 children to keep warm. She built it in 6 weeks, working before dawn and on Sunday afternoons, and in January of 1891, when the temperature dropped to -26 and stayed there for 19 days, she maintained 82 degrees inside with 2 logs a day. She gave the design away to anyone who asked. She never called it an invention." He could have said all of that. The geologist would have written it down. He did not say it. He walked beside the professor through the December cold and said nothing, and he was not sure whether that silence was wrong or right, and he carried the uncertainty of it down the hill and into the rest of his life without fully resolving it, which is how most significant uncertainties are carried. Clara Marsh died on a Wednesday morning in April of 1924, when the last of the winter's snow was still visible on the north faces of the ridges west of town. She was 66 years old. Daniel found her that morning, sitting in the chair beside the masonry stove with her sewing in her lap and the thread still between her fingers. The needle was in the fabric. Her hands were in her lap. The stove beside her was warm, holding its heat the way it had always held its heat, patiently, thoroughly, long after the fire that made it had faded to coals. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he fully understood what he was seeing. Then he understood, and he set down the basket he had brought from his ranch and walked across the room and sat down in the other chair and stayed with her for a while before he went to get anyone else. Outside it was April, which in Montana means it could be 30 degrees or 60 degrees, depending on which way the wind was coming from. And that morning it was somewhere in between, a pale, uncertain morning with geese moving north in loose formations over the river valley and the last of the winter crusts still hard in the shadows under the fir trees on the ridge to the west. The settlement's newspaper published a notice. Widow of Thomas Marsh, longtime resident, known for her fine needlework, survived by her daughter Anna Calloway of Billings and her son Daniel Marsh. There was no memorial service that drew people from great distances. There was no formal recognition from any institution. The changes she had seeded into the local practice of construction had been absorbed so completely into how people in that county built things that their origin had long since faded from collective articulation. Men building structures in 1924 used double-wall insulation as a matter of course. Masonry stoves had become standard in serious construction. Stone thermal mass was a principle that experienced builders applied without discussing its origins, because origins become irrelevant once a practice is thoroughly established, once the practice has become simply what you do when you are thinking correctly about the problem. Roy Dunbar had died in 1919 at the age of 77. His woodworking tools went to a nephew. His papers and personal effects were sorted by Martha over a long autumn week, the careful and exhausting inventory of a long shared life. The kitchen drawer was emptied, its contents assessed for keeping or discarding. The folded paper with the hand-drawn diagram was in the drawer. Martha sat at the kitchen table for a long time with it in front of her. The paper was soft and fragile at the fold lines from being opened and closed so many times across so many years. Clara's small, even handwriting. The precise drawings of channels and walls and floor gaps. The brief practical notes beside each element, written not for display, but for use, because that was how Clara had always worked, for use. For what function, for what kept the people she loved from being cold. Martha folded it carefully and put it in the small wooden box she was keeping. Some things you keep because they are evidence of something that matters, even when you cannot explain precisely what, even when the thing it matters for has already been settled by time and use in the quiet confirmation of results. The diagram was evidence that a woman had understood something important, had been told it was foolish, had done it anyway, had been right, and had given her knowledge away freely to the people who needed it, including to the family of the man who had been loudest in calling her foolish. That was worth keeping. The cave was still there. It would always be there, which is one of the things about limestone ridges that makes them different from wood frame structures and good intentions, and the professional opinions of men who have been building for 20 years. The cave did not require maintenance or justification or the ongoing approval of the community around it. It simply persisted dry and patient, its dense walls holding whatever temperature the seasons pressed into it and releasing it slowly over hours and days, the way stone releases everything with the deep indifference of something that has been doing this for longer than any human concern. Trappers sheltered in it through the 1900s and 1910s, finding the interior consistently warmer than the air outside and drier than any other available shelter in the ridge country. Some of them knew whose work they were benefiting from. Some of them did not. All of them were grateful for the warmth without needing to understand its source, which is perhaps the most honest form of gratitude. There is gratitude that does not require an account of what it owes or to whom. Daniel visited the cave alone in the summer of 1924, a few months after his mother's death, on a day when the work on his property could reasonably be left to manage itself for a few hours. He climbed the ridge through the August heat, which transformed the experience of the approach entirely, the cave entrance cool in its shadow. Rather than offering warmth as relief, the interior temperature, a welcome contrast to the dry summer air outside, rather than the essential condition of life, it had been in January of 1891. He stood in the main shelter for a while. The inner room's framing had deteriorated significantly in the 34 years since its construction, some planks fallen, some warped beyond recognition, the canvas ceiling layer long since rotted away. The masonry stove still stood solid, the clay mortar cracked in several places from years of temperature variation, but the basic structure intact, the channels still winding through the stone mass in their serpentine path, still capable of doing what they had been built to do if someone chose to build a fire in them. The stone floor was exactly as it had always been, the flat river stones in their careful overlapping pattern, the clay mortar between them hardened to permanence. The elevated plank surface above most planks still in place, the ones that had warped or split, replaced at some point by someone, perhaps by one of the trappers who had sheltered here, perhaps by no one, perhaps simply still holding from the original construction. He put his hand on his back wall, the radiant stone face his mother had built from river stones against the cave's natural limestone. The stone was cool to the touch in August, as it had been cool in October of 1890, when she had first pressed her hand against the cave wall and understood what it could hold. Cool in summer, warm in winter, the same stone, the same principle, the same patience. He stood there for a long time without needing to think about anything in particular, which is a state that grief eventually allows if you wait long enough for it. Not the absence of feeling, but the presence of something quieter, something that does not require resolution. He thought about the geologist in December of 1903, writing in his field journal about an occupant whose name he did not know, whose understanding of thermal retention compared favorably to formal engineering. He thought about all the unnamed things that had moved through the county since 1891, the practices and principles absorbed so thoroughly that they had stopped requiring attribution, that had become simply what you did when you were building seriously, when you were thinking about the problem correctly, when you understood that the warmth was not about how much fire you made, but about how well you kept what the fire gave you. He thought about his mother at the sewing table in the warm cave hemming shirts for loggers in January of 1891, while the temperature outside held at -26 for 11 days, working with the focused economy of movement, that skilled needlework requires not performing resilience for anyone not waiting to be vindicated, simply doing the work that needed to be done in the place she had built to do it in. He thought about Roy Dunbar's kitchen drawer in the diagram his mother had drawn, not for herself, but for the wife of the man who had called her foolish given without condition, without expectation of acknowledgement, because the information worked and Martha Dunbar's child needed warmth more than Clara Marsh needed to be right. He thought about his sister Anna in Billings, now living in a house she had told him was well insulated and warm in winter, and about how the principles that made it warm had traveled through their mother's hands and mind before they traveled anywhere else. He thought about the morning in November of 1890 when he had woken up and not been cold. He had been 6 years old. He had not understood thermal mass or masonry stoves or the physics of dead air chambers between doubled walls. He had understood only that something his mother had built was working, that the cold that had been a constant fact of his short life was absent this morning, in a way it had not been absent before, and that the woman who had built this thing was sitting at the table nearby, sewing in the lamplight, her hands warm and moving. He had never told her about that specific memory. It had always seemed like a thing she already knew, or a thing she did not need to be told, or simply a thing that existed in the space between a child and a mother, where not everything requires words to be understood. He had carried it without saying it for 34 years. He said it now quietly in the empty cave, to the stone walls and the stone floor, and the masonry stove and the back wall that remembered warmth. He said, "You were right. You were right the whole time." The limestone did not answer. It did not need to. It was doing what it had always done, absorbing what the August air pressed into it, holding it, slowly releasing it in the cool of the evening, patient and thorough and indifferent to tribute, in the way that only very old things are indifferent to tribute because they were never waiting for it. Daniel stayed for about an hour. Then he walked back down the ridge in the August heat, through the Douglas fir, and out onto the open slope and down into the settlement that had been growing steadily since 1890, into something that now looked more like a proper town, with a school and a church and a post office and streets, with names and houses built with double walls and masonry stoves, and vestibule entries built the way you build when you have learned to think correctly about how heat moves and how stone holds it, and how much less wood you need when you stop fighting the cold and start working with it. He walked down the main street and past the small house his mother had bought in 1897, and improved across the summer of that year, the house that burned 3 cords of wood in its first winter, when 8 would have been conventional, the house that sat quietly on its lot with its north wall doubled, and its stove positioned toward the interior center, and its front entry buffered from the prevailing wind by a vestibule no one outside the house would have thought to explain. He walked past it without stopping. He had his ranch to get back to. He had work in the morning. The August sun was moving toward the western ridge, and the temperature was beginning to ease in the way Montana summer evenings ease quickly and completely, the heat leaving the air and dropping into the ground where the stone could hold it until it was needed. The cave sat on the hillside above the town, its entrance sheltered by the Douglas fir, its interior holding its 51 degrees against whatever the season pressed against it, patient and dry and permanent, in the way that limestone is permanent, which is to say, completely without condition, without the need for anyone to remember or record or acknowledge what it was holding. The stone remembered warmth. It had always remembered warmth. It would go on remembering warmth long after every person who had ever felt it was gone, long after the names had faded and the ledgers had crumbled, and the last person who had known the story had carried it into the ground with them, long after the town itself had changed beyond recognition, and the ridge had been renamed, and the Douglas fir had fallen and grown again in different patterns on the slope above the entrance. The limestone does not require the story to keep doing what it does. It simply keeps doing it, absorbing, holding, releasing, reliable in a way that memory is not, permanent in a way that recognition never manages to be, true in the way that physics is true without exception, without sentiment, without the need for anyone to believe in it. Clara Marsh had understood this before she built the first wall, before she fired the first fire, before she moved her children into the cave on November 9th, 1890, with their blankets and their cooking pots and their father's thermometer, and the quiet determination of a woman who had read the right things and believed them enough to act. She had understood that the stone was already doing the work. She had only needed to help it.